Frost on dead grass. A pickup truck door creaks open at 5 a.m. Simon Halloway steps out into 100 acres of crooked black-barked apple trees, half of them leaning like drunks, bark peeling in ribbons. He doesn't carry pruning shears. He carries a bucket of fish heads. He walks to the ugliest tree in the row, split trunk, hollow center, and digs a trench around its roots with his bare hands. He drops the fish heads in, covers them with dirt, moves to the next tree. Behind him on the county road, a truck slows down. A man leans out the window, laughing. "You feeding the dead things now, Halloway?" the man hollers. Simon doesn't answer. He just keeps walking the rows with his bucket, breath fogging, boots sinking into mud still hard with frost at the edges. Behind him, 90 acres of orchard stretch toward a gray tree line, trees nobody has pruned in 11 years, trees the county already marked for removal. He stops at a trunk with a hand-carved tag wired to a low branch. He touches it the way another man might touch a photograph. Then he keeps digging. By the time the sun clears the ridge, he has buried fish beneath 40 trees and told no one why. Word around Miners Fork was that Simon Halloway had lost his sense along with his wife. Some said grief made a man plant strange things in strange ground. Others said it plainer, that he was burying his last dollar in dirt that was already dead. Nobody in Belhaven County could explain what he was really building out there, row after crooked row, before the ground even thawed for spring. If you're new here, this is the kind of story we tell, the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the folks the whole county wrote off before the harvest came in. Hit subscribe if you want more of them, and drop a comment with the town or state you're watching from tonight. It always surprises me how far these stories travel. Miners Fork sits in the fold of Belhaven County, Kentucky, where the hills close in tight enough that the sun doesn't clear the ridge till near 8 in the morning. It is the kind of town with one blinking light, a Baptist church older than the courthouse, and a feed store where every stool at the counter belongs to somebody by unwritten right. Simon Halloway had grown up 2 towns over, driving long-haul freight for 11 years, gone 3 weeks out of 4, while his wife Adeline raised their daughter Junie alone in a rented house with a leaking roof. Then Adeline got sick, fast and mean, the kind of sick that empties a bank account before it empties a house. Simon came off the road for good to sit with her the last 4 months. When she passed, he had nothing left but a 9-year-old daughter, a truck with bad brakes, and a hole in him nobody in town knew how to talk around. He didn't go back to driving. He said the road took enough from him already. The Castellic Orchard, 90 acres on the north end of the county, had sat abandoned since old man Castellic died with no children to claim it. The county sold it off at the back tax auction for less than the price of a used car, mostly because nobody wanted it. Fire blight had gotten into half the trees years before, black and weeping at the branch tips, and the county extension office had it flagged on a watch list. Simon bought it anyway, the week after the funeral, using nearly every dollar Adeline's small life insurance policy had left them. His daughter Junie remembers the day he told her. She was doing homework at the kitchen table, and he set the deed down next to her math worksheet like it was nothing. "We're going to grow something," was all he said. She didn't understand it then. She understood the ridicule better, the way kids at school repeated what their fathers said at the feed store, that her daddy had bought a dead orchard with a dead woman's money. The county extension agent, a clipped, careful man named Percy Lloyd, drove out within the month. He walked 2 rows, noted the blighted limbs, the split bark, the sunken cankers weeping amber sap, and told Simon flatly that the land was a hazard to every healthy orchard for 5 miles around. "Fire blight spreads on wind and rain and bees," he said. Half his trees carried it. If Simon didn't bring the orchard under control, the county would issue a phytosanitary quarantine. And if that control wasn't demonstrated within 2 growing seasons, the whole 90 acres would be condemned and bulldozed, root and stump, to protect the county's working orchards. Simon just nodded and said, "Give me the 2 years." What the county didn't know was that Simon had spent every night that first winter in the library 2 towns over, reading everything the librarian could pull for him on old-world orchard keeping, dry-stack stone terracing, gill planting, buried fish and bone for nitrogen, comfrey planted at the drip line to pull minerals up from deep in the clay. Techniques his own grandfather, a Kentucky Hill farmer, had used before chemical sprays made all of it look like foolishness. Simon wasn't ignoring the blight. He was trying something nobody in 3 counties had tried in 50 years, rebuilding the orchard's whole living system from the roots up, instead of fighting the diseased tree by dying tree. By March, neighbors driving the county road past the Castellic place saw things that made them slow the truck down. Simon digging shallow trenches around each tree and packing them with rotted wood, ash, and manure, what he'd read the old-timers called a hugel ring. Beehive boxes going up along the fence line, a dozen of them unpainted pine catching the morning light. A creek that had run dry for a decade suddenly diverted, trickling now through a hand-dug swale that curved along the orchard's low side like a vein. Odell Sykes, who ran the commercial orchard on the county's east side and sat on the Extension Advisory Board, stopped his truck at the fence one afternoon and watched Simon on his knees, grafting a scion from a scraggly wild apple onto one of the old Castellic trunks. "You're grafting weed trees onto dead ones," Odell said, not unkindly, just baffled. "Boy, half these trunks got blight in the cambium. You're wasting good scion wood." Simon wiped his hands on his jeans. "These old trunks survived 11 years with nobody watering them, spraying them, or loving them," he said. "I want to know what they know." Odell laughed the way a man laughs at something he's decided not to argue with. He drove off shaking his head, and by supper the story was all over the feed store counter. Halloway's out there marrying weed trees to blight trees, digging ditches, and paying good money for bees nobody asked for. Somebody joked he ought to graft a scion onto his own head, see if any sense would take. Junie heard that one at school the next day, from a boy 2 grades up. She came home and asked her father if it was true, what people said. Simon told her the truth was standing right outside the kitchen window. And someday it would speak for itself. The first setback came in May of that first year. A hard, late frost rolled down off the ridge 2 nights running and burned every blossom Simon had coaxed onto the young grafts. He walked the rows at dawn and found the delicate white flowers gone brown and curled, whole limbs of new growth blackened at the tip. 11 months of careful work, gone in one cold night. He sat down in the mud between 2 trees and didn't move for a long while. Junie found him there when she came looking for him before the school bus came, and she didn't say anything. She just sat down next to him in the wet grass. That night, Percy Lloyd's office sent a letter reminding him the quarantine clock had not paused for weather. One growing season gone, one left. Odell Sykes, hearing about the frost, told the men at the feed store counter it was a mercy, really. The county would have had to bulldoze it anyway. Better the frost did it cheap. Simon read the letter twice at the kitchen table after Junie went to bed, then folded it and put it in a drawer. In the morning he was back in the orchard before light, regrafting every ruined limb from scion wood he'd saved wrapped in damp burlap in the cellar, because he'd learned from those library books never to cut just one. The second year, Simon changed nothing about his method and everything about his pace. He was in the orchard before Junie woke and after she slept, mulching, watching the bees work the comfrey blooms, thinning fruit by hand so the trees wouldn't overbear on their first real season back. He kept a notebook, which trees leafed out clean, which still wept sap at the graft unions, which limbs he needed to cut clean back to healthy wood. Slowly through that second summer, the orchard began to look less like a graveyard and more like something breathing. Neighbors still slowed their trucks. Fewer of them laughed now. Some just watched, quiet, unsure what they were watching. By the 2nd August, word reached Simon that fire blight had broken out bad across the county. A wet spring, a warm snap, the perfect conditions the extension office had been dreading for years. Odell Sykes lost nearly a third of his commercial block in 2 weeks, whole rows of modern grafted trees blackening at the blossom end and dying back to the trunk. Other orchards up and down the valley reported the same. The county extension office was fielding calls daily. And out at the Castellic place, with Percy Lloyd's final inspection now only 3 weeks away, Simon Halloway kept walking his rows in silence, watching, waiting to see what his 90 acres would do. Percy Lloyd arrived on inspection day with a clipboard and low expectations. He'd seen the frost damage report from the prior spring. He'd heard the feed store talk. He expected stumps, maybe, or a half-managed mess he'd have no choice but to condemn. Instead, he stood at the fence line between the Castellic orchard and Odell Sykes's east block, and for a long moment he didn't write anything at all. On Odell's side, blackened limbs, wilted leaves curled like burnt paper, whole trees stripped bare by blight in a single season. On Simon's side, not 30 feet away, heavy blossom gone to fruit, leaves dark and glossy, not a single canker weeping on the grafted trunks. Lloyd walked the rows himself, slower now, checking graft union after graft union, running his thumb along bark that should have been split and weeping and wasn't. He crouched at the base of the ugliest, oldest tree in the whole orchard, the one Simon had buried fish beneath that first frozen morning, and found it heavy with small green apples, its bark tight and healthy clear up to the crown. He stood there a long moment, clipboard hanging loose at his side, looking down the row at 90 acres doing something his training had never quite prepared him to see. Within a week, trucks started turning up the gravel drive that used to sit empty for months at a time. A cidery from 2 counties over, hunting rootstock that had survived the blight year unscathed. A small distillery, hearing rumor of rare old apple varieties nobody had tasted since before the Depression. Neighbors who'd laughed at the fish and the bees came walking the rows themselves now, hats off, asking Simon what he'd done, and how, and whether he'd teach them. Odell Sykes came too, hands in his pockets, and stood a long time in front of the old scraggly trunk before he finally said, "I owe you a longer conversation than I gave you at that fence." By harvest, word had traveled well past Belhaven County, buyers driving in from 3 states over, chasing apple varieties they'd only read about in old nursery catalogs. Simon and Junie filled crate after crate together in the cool of early mornings, her hands stained with dirt the way his had been that first winter. Percy Lloyd's final report, filed that October, didn't recommend condemnation. It recommended the county extension office study the orchard as a model. 2 years to the day after he dug that first trench, Simon stood at the edge of his 90 acres watching the sun clear the ridge over trees heavy with fruit nobody had thought would survive one more winter, let alone thrive past a blight that took down half the county. Junie stood beside him, no longer the girl who'd sat with him in the mud, but a girl who understood now what he'd been building all along, not just an orchard, but proof that a thing left for dead still remembers how to live, if somebody's willing to kneel down in the cold and feed it. Belhaven County still tells it a certain way at the feed store counter, not as the story of a widower who lost his mind, but the one about the man who buried fish under dying trees and grew back an orchard the whole county said couldn't be saved. Simon never did explain the method to anyone who didn't ask twice. He just handed them a shovel and said the ground would do the explaining if they gave it time enough to answer.